The dawn was just beginning to illuminate Ouagadougou when the phone of Ibrahim Traoré, the young interim president of Burkina Faso, a former captain and the world's youngest head of state at 34, rang. Immediately, his attention turned to the alert. His national security chief, Colonel Siaka Ouattara, was on the other end of the line. "Mr. President, we've detected unusual radio signals coming from the Gunga district," he said. "They're encrypted frequencies that our technicians can't decipher." "This isn't civilian equipment." Traoré sat up in bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling of his modest bedroom. Since his rise to power in October 2022, he knew his government was walking a tightrope. His nationalist stance and decisions to diversify the country's international partnerships, particularly with Russia, had created tensions with former colonial powers. "How long have these signals been active?" he asked, his calm voice contrasting with the growing unease that had haunted him for 3 days. However, their intensity had significantly increased since the previous night. An hour later, Traoré was seated in the command room of the Armed Forces headquarters. In front of him, screens displayed frequency analysis charts and a city map with several blinking red dots. "These emissions are coming from 5 different locations," explained the military technician, "all in residential or tourist areas, with no connection to our embassies or recognized international institutions." General Souleymane Sanou, a loyal ally of Traoré, rushed into the room holding a sealed document. His face reflected an unusual tension. "Mr. President, we received this information from our Malian colleagues. 5 American citizens entered Burkina Faso last week with diplomatic visas, but are not linked to any official mission." Traoré quickly leafed through the document. The 5 men had arrived separately at different entry points in the country before converging on Ouagadougou. They presented credentials from an NGO called Global Education Initiative, claiming to be on a mission to rebuild schools in areas affected by terrorism. "Does this NGO actually exist?" Traoré inquired. The document confirmed it did, but it had been registered only 6 months earlier and had no significant media presence. Apparently, a ghost organization. Earlier, a young local journalist, Abdo Zongo, known for his rigorous investigations into regional politics, had contacted a friend in the Ministry of Security. He had noticed something odd. A white man, posing as an infrastructure consultant, had asked specific questions about the electrical system powering the presidential palace during a conference on urban development. He wanted to know the location of emergency generators, protocols in case of a power outage, and details that even local engineers wouldn't freely share. By noon, Traoré convened an emergency meeting with his closest advisors. The room was hermetically sealed, mobile phones banned. "I demand discreet but total surveillance of these 5 individuals," he ordered. "No confrontation. We need to understand what they're really after." Colonel Ouattara nodded. "We've already begun surveillance. One of them rented a house with a direct view of your daily route between the palace and military headquarters." A heavy silence hung over the room. Everyone grasped the implications. These men weren't there to rebuild schools. At 2:30 p.m., a communication intercept revealed an exchange between one of the suspects and an unidentified satellite signal captured the phrases "windows of opportunity" and "imminent transition" before the transmission was cut off that same evening as the sun set over Burkina Faso's capital. A diplomatic note arrived from a neighboring country, also governed by a military junta with positions similar to Traoré's. It contained an unequivocal warning. "Reliable sources indicate that a destabilization operation may target the government in the coming days. Beware of friends bearing solutions." In his office, Traoré stayed up late into the night, reviewing reports and analyzing photographs of 5 Americans. His seasoned soldier's instinct told him something serious was being prepared. International pressures had intensified since his stance against French military presence and his alignment with Moscow. On his desk, a framed photo of Thomas Sankara, the Burkinabe revolutionary assassinated in 1987, seemed to remind him that sovereign choices in Africa could sometimes come at a high price. "This time," he murmured, switching off the lamp, "we'll be ready." In the streets of Ouagadougou under the starry sky, 5 ordinary-looking men continued their activities, unaware that they were now on the young president's radar. The chess game had begun. The next morning, Ibrahim Traoré woke with renewed determination. He had made his decision during the night. Instead of waiting passively for the threat to materialize, he would take the initiative. "We'll set a trap for them," he announced to his inner circle, gathered at dawn in a discreet farm on the outskirts of the capital. "We'll spread word that I'm going to Bobo Dioulasso tomorrow for a surprise inspection of the armed forces, but let it remain confidential, as if it leaked accidentally." Colonel Traoré flashed a smile. "Let's see if they take the bait." "Exactly. And in the meantime, intensify surveillance. I want to know their every move, every call, every person they meet." Burkina Faso's intelligence services sprang into action immediately. Civilian agents were deployed around the Americans' residences, while cybersecurity experts trained by Russian allies attempted to intercept their communications. By noon, the first significant clue emerged. One of the suspects, identified as Michael Peterson, had hurriedly left his hotel to head to a cyber cafe, avoiding using his own laptop. He checked flight schedules to Bobo Dioulasso and road itineraries, according to the agent observing him. Then he sent an encrypted message via a secure messaging service. Abdou Zongo, the journalist following the case meanwhile, uncovered troubling information by digging through digital archives. He discovered that 3 of the 5 Americans had been in Mali shortly before the coup that ousted the sitting president in 2020. Too much of a coincidence to ignore. At 4 p.m., another suspect, posing as David Williams, attempted to approach a non-commissioned officer of the Presidential Guard in a bar frequented by military personnel. The man offered a substantial sum in exchange for information about the captain's habits, referring to Traoré by his former military rank. The officer, loyal to his president, accepted the offer and reported everything to his superiors. In his report, he mentioned a crucial detail. The American had hinted that a peaceful transition was desirable to avoid a scenario like Sankara's. This allusion to the assassination of the Burkinabe revolutionary sparked a cold fury in Traoré when he learned of it. "They're no longer hiding their intentions," he said quietly. "The pieces were falling into place, but they underestimated our vigilance." By 8 p.m., further false information about the trip to Bobo Dioulasso began circulating in certain military circles as planned. The suspects' activity intensified immediately. 2 of them hurriedly left their homes and met at a popular restaurant in the Gunga district. Surveillance tightened. "This is our window," one of them said. "The road to Bobo passes through less secure areas. If something happens there," the American sought assurances that the transition would be attributed to internal factors, the other responded. "We can't leave American fingerprints." The CIA headquarters confirmed Traoré's worst suspicions. This wasn't just an intelligence mission, it was an attempted coup, perhaps even an assassination plot. At 11 p.m., Colonel Ouattara presented an action plan to Traoré. "We have enough evidence to act now. We propose a simultaneous intervention to apprehend the 5 suspects before they can coordinate their actions. For tomorrow," Traoré approved with a nod. "Proceed, but with utmost discretion. No excesses, no unnecessary violence. I want them alive and able to talk." At midnight, Burkina Faso's special forces moved into action in a perfectly synchronized operation. 4 of the 5 suspects were arrested at their respective residences. The 5th, alerted by the radio silence of his accomplices, attempted to flee via the road to neighboring Ghana, but was intercepted at a roadside checkpoint. By dawn, among the seized evidence were sophisticated communication devices, small arms with silencers, detailed files on Traoré and his inner circle, and most alarmingly, an operation plan codenamed Sahelian Renaissance that explicitly mentioned installing a government aligned with Western interests. In the early morning, as Ouagadougou awoke unaware of the drama that had unfolded overnight, Ibrahim Traoré faced the 5 detained men in a secure military base outside the city. "Gentlemen," he said calmly in English, "you are on the territory of a sovereign nation. You are neither diplomats nor humanitarian workers. You are foreign agents who came to destabilize our nation. Now we will have a long conversation about who exactly sent you here and why." The eyes of the 5 Americans revealed a mix of surprise and resignation. The trap had closed, and they knew the young president, whom they had underestimated, had just won the first round of a game with significant geopolitical consequences. The interrogations lasted 3 days, conducted in absolute secrecy, under Ibrahim Traoré's direct supervision, alternating between silent observation behind a one-way mirror and direct confrontation with the detainees. Initially, the 5 Americans maintained the fiction of their humanitarian cover stories, but their narratives quickly crumbled under the weight of evidence amassed by Burkina Faso's services. It was the man identified as David Williams who broke first, after Traoré showed him photographs of himself with CIA officers at a reception in the American embassy in Abidjan 2 years earlier. "You're not in a position to deny the evidence," Traoré stated calmly. "We have the necessary patience, but you may not have enough time before your absence triggers emergency protocols, do you?" Williams lowered his eyes. "I can't speak for the others, but yes, I work for the agency. Our mission was to assess Burkina Faso's political stability and prepare scenarios for..." During the second day of the crisis, Traoré heard an interesting euphemism for a coup d'état. The group's apparent leader, an older man named Richard Anderson, finally acknowledged the existence of an operation called Sahel Shield. According to his meticulously recorded confessions, the operation aimed to redirect Burkina Faso's foreign policy in response to its growing ties with Russia and distancing from France and the United States. "Our mission wasn't to assassinate," he insisted, "but to create conditions for a leadership change by internal elements." Traoré pressed, "Which internal elements exactly?" After a long silence, Anderson named 3 individuals, 2 generals and a former minister, still influential, whom Traoré had sidelined due to their ties to the former colonial power. The third day brought the most disturbing discovery on Michael Peterson's laptop. Burkina Faso's cybersecurity experts uncovered documents detailing a multi-year influence plan to keep Sahel countries within the Western orbit. The document, classified as top secret, revealed a coordinated strategy among various American agencies to counter the growing influence of Russia and China in the region. More troubling still, the plan explicitly outlined the use of economic, media, and diplomatic pressures to isolate leaders resistant to Western interests, with a special mention of Traoré, deemed a potential significant threat to regional stability, according to American interests. Meanwhile, outside the facility, the government's silence on the arrests began to fuel rumors. The American embassy in Ouagadougou issued a terse statement, noting that 5 American citizens working for an NGO had been out of contact for several days and requesting information about them. Abdou Zongo, the journalist who helped expose the case, started receiving anonymous messages warning him about revelations that could destabilize the entire region. Instead of being intimidated, he intensified his research, discovering that similar operations had potentially occurred in other African countries that had recently shifted their geopolitical alignments. By the end of the third day, Traoré convened his National Security Council for a critical decision. "We have several options," he explained. "Quietly expel these men in exchange for American concessions, publicly try them for espionage and attempted destabilization, or use the revelations as leverage in a broader strategy." General Sanu spoke up. "Mr. President, the Americans won't come clean. They'll claim these men acted without official authorization, rogue elements. That's precisely why a public trial could backfire," added the foreign minister. "Without irrefutable proof, without official documents, their word against ours will only convince those already convinced." Traoré remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the map of Africa hanging on the meeting room wall, before standing. "Our strength lies not in secrecy but in transparency. These men didn't come just for Burkina Faso. They're part of a system that still views Africa as its backyard. Our response must transcend our specific case." His decision was made. Burkina Faso would reveal the attempted destabilization, not in isolation, but in coordination with other African nations sharing similar concerns. He ordered immediate contact with allies in Mali, Guinea, and Niger, demanding an urgent meeting of heads of state. "What we've uncovered affects us all." As diplomatic communications intensified between Ouagadougou, Bamako, Conakry, and Niamey, Ibrahim Traoré, alone, addressed Richard Anderson's cell. "Mr. Anderson," he said with icy courtesy, "tomorrow your presence here will become an international matter, but I want to tell you something personally. The era when foreign powers could decide the fate of African nations is over. It's not out of hatred for the West that we diversify our partners, but out of the necessity for sovereign development." Anderson looked at him with a mix of resignation and apprehension. "Captain, you're playing a dangerous game. Some forces don't forgive easily." Traoré smiled faintly. I'm not playing, Mr. Anderson. That's your fundamental flaw. For you, Africa is a chessboard. For us, it's our home. At the dawn of the fourth day, an official announcement was broadcast on national radio. President Ibrahim Traoré would address the nation that evening regarding a serious threat to national security that had been neutralized. The effect was immediate. A wave of anticipation and apprehension swept the country, while alarm bells began ringing in Western chancelleries. The announcement of Traoré's imminent speech triggered frantic activity in Western embassies in Ouagadougou. Urgent calls were made to Washington, Paris, and London as analysts scrambled to understand what was unfolding. At 2 p.m., the American ambassador requested an emergency meeting with Burkina Faso's foreign minister. His request was politely but firmly denied, with the information that the minister was attending a national security meeting and would not be available before the presidential address. Meanwhile, at an isolated military base on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a discreet but high-level delegation arrived by military plane. The presidents of Mali, Niger, and Guinea's leader met in an impromptu but crucial summit, far from prying eyes. "What you've uncovered confirms our own suspicions," declared Mali's president, after reviewing the gathered evidence. "We detected similar activities in Bamako last month, but couldn't clearly identify those responsible." Guinea's delegation leader, Ayessa, added, "Since we demanded the renegotiation of mining contracts with Western multinationals, we've faced increasing pressure and attempts at internal destabilization." Ibrahim Traoré laid out his vision. "We must coordinate our response. Individually, each of our countries can be isolated and pressured. Together, we represent a bloc capable of resisting external interference." At 5 p.m., as the sun began its descent over Ouagadougou, a joint statement was drafted and approved by the four heads of state. The document denounced the persistent attempts by certain powers to maintain their influence in Africa through methods contrary to international law and respect for national sovereignty. In Washington, news of the extraordinary meeting of Sahelian leaders prompted a crisis meeting at the National Security Council. The implications extended far beyond Burkina Faso. The entire American strategy in West Africa risked being compromised. At 8 p.m. sharp, Ibrahim Traoré appeared on television screens and radio waves across Burkina Faso, dressed in his military uniform. He stood before the flags of Burkina Faso and the African Union. His face was serious but resolute. "People of Burkina Faso, dear African compatriots following this address beyond our borders," he began, "I address you tonight to report on grave events affecting our national sovereignty, but also the future of our international relations." With precise and clinical tone, he detailed the discovery and arrest of the 5 American agents, methodically presenting the collected evidence: photographs of espionage equipment, excerpts from seized documents, and transcripts of confessions. These men did not come to build schools or care for our sick. They came to decide who should govern our country, based on the interests they represent. They targeted our nation precisely because we chose to diversify our international partnerships and break with decades of exclusive dependence. He went on, revealing the existence of the Sahel Shield document without disclosing its entirety, but quoting specific passages about strategies to neutralize elements hostile to Western interests. "I want to be clear that this revelation is not a declaration of hostility against the American people, whom we respect. It is a denunciation of methods from another era, incompatible with relations between sovereign and equal nations." Then followed the announcement that would electrify African and global public opinion. "In coordination with our brothers in Mali, Niger, and Guinea, we have decided on a joint response to these acts of interference. Starting tomorrow, our countries will establish an international commission of inquiry to document all similar attempts in Africa. We invite all African nations that have experienced similar incidents to participate," he added in a clear message to Western powers. "We demand official apologies and guarantees of non-repetition. In the meantime, the 5 detained agents will face justice in Burkina Faso for espionage and attempting to destabilize a sovereign state." The international reaction was immediate and intense. In New York, the U.S. representative at the UN vehemently denied any official U.S. government involvement, calling the accusations fabricated to justify an authoritarian shift. In Paris, the French government called for restraint and dialogue, carefully avoiding comment on the merits of the revelations. However, it was in Africa that the impact was most profound. From Dakar to Johannesburg, crowds gathered spontaneously to express support for Traoré and other Sahel leaders. On social media, the hashtag #WishAfricaIsNotYourPlayground went viral, shared millions of times. Abdou Zongo, whose journalistic work helped expose the case, published a detailed analysis that evening, translated and republished by media outlets worldwide. He analyzed the geopolitical implications of this unprecedented confrontation. The case of the Ouagadougou Five, as they are already known, potentially marks a turning point in relations between former colonial powers and Africa. This is not just about foreign policy, but about dignity reclaimed after decades of often imposed influence. In the light of day, Ibrahim Traoré received a secure call from an American emissary proposing discreet discussions to resolve the situation. His response was as brief as it was clear. "Our position has already been expressed publicly. Any future discussions must also be public. Backroom deals are over." The diplomatic arm began to move, but in a few hours, a young captain turned president had managed to transform an attempt to destabilize his country into a potentially historic moment for the entire continent. 3 weeks after Ibrahim Traoré's explosive revelations, 3 weeks of intense diplomatic, media, and judicial activity profoundly transformed the African and international geopolitical landscape. The trial of the Ouagadougou Five began in Burkina Faso's Supreme Court, in a room packed with journalists from around the world. Contrary to Western expectations, the process was rigorously respectful of the defendants' rights, ensuring access to international lawyers assisted with simultaneous translation, with observers from the African Union and the United Nations present. The 5 Americans, accused of espionage, pleaded guilty, but claimed they were following orders in a standard security assessment, denying any intent to overthrow the government. Their defense crumbled when the prosecutor presented seized documents, including transcripts of communications with their superiors, which explicitly mentioned a post-Traoré succession in Washington. The official U.S. government stance, after initially denying any involvement, subtly evolved. The State Department acknowledged that some operational elements may have exceeded their observation mandate. This semi-admission was widely interpreted as an attempt to avoid a broader confrontation with the emerging Sahelian bloc. The Pan-African Commission of Inquiry into Foreign Interference, established as announced by Traoré, began its work in Bamako, chaired by an eminent South African jurist. The commission quickly received testimonies and documents from 12 African countries, revealing similar patterns of covert influence and pressure on governments seeking to emancipate from traditional spheres of influence. On the diplomatic stage, a new reality emerged. The 4 Sahel countries, now joined by Chad and the Central African Republic, began speaking in unison at international forums. Their common position crystallized around 3 principles: inalienable sovereignty in partnership choices, mandatory transparency in defense and security agreements, and renegotiation of resource extraction contracts deemed unfair. Abdou Zongo, transformed into an internationally renowned journalist, published a documented series of articles titled "The New Independentists," analyzing how this case catalyzed an unprecedented Pan-African movement since the independences of the 1960s. After weeks of hearings, the jury delivered its verdict. The 5 Americans were found guilty of espionage and conspiring against state security. The sentence, relatively lenient given the circumstances, was 10 years in prison, with the possibility of extradition to the United States after 5 years, provided strict conditions were met. The American response was restrained, signaling a desire to avoid diplomatic escalation. In a carefully worded statement, the State Department expressed concerns about the trial's impartiality, while announcing an internal investigation into potential unauthorized operations in West Africa. In Western chancelleries, a realization solidified. The dynamics of relations with Africa had irrevocably changed. The days when covert operations could topple African governments without significant diplomatic consequences seemed to be over. A month after the verdict, Ibrahim Traoré accepted a historic invitation to speak at the United Nations General Assembly. His speech, delivered in French and Dioula, one of Burkina Faso's national languages, instantly became emblematic of a new diplomatic era. "We come to this platform not to accuse or condemn," he declared. We come to affirm that Africa is no longer a playground for political games, but a partner demanding justice and sovereignty. Sovereignty is non-negotiable, dignity is indivisible. He continued, proposing a new contract between Africa and world powers based on 5 principles: absolute respect for sovereignty and development and alliance choices, complete transparency in military and economic agreements, fair redistribution of benefits from natural resources, genuine technology transfer, and recognition of historical damages caused by colonization and neocolonialism. We extend our hand to all who accept these principles, from the east or west, north or south, but we will no longer bow to those who confuse partnership with domination. The ovation that followed his speech, including from many Western delegations, revealed a profound shift in international perceptions. 6 months after the initial revelations, the concrete effects of the Ouagadougou 5 case transformed the continent's landscape. A new era of international relations opened for Africa. Neighboring countries joined Traoré's initiative, forming a robust regional alliance that now spoke with a single voice on security and development issues. The self-determination movement spread like wildfire, from the Sahel to the Atlantic coasts. Former colonial powers reconsidered their military presence in the region, compelled by simultaneous popular and diplomatic pressure. At the same time, new partnerships emerged with powers like China and Russia, but on fairer terms than before, promoting local development and technology transfer. Even international financial institutions, long inflexible in their conditionalities, began reviewing their approaches in the face of this Africa that now rejected external economic dictates. A new page in North-South relations was being written, with Burkina Faso and its allies as unexpected authors. Ibrahim Traoré, the former captain turned symbol of an Africa reaffirming its sovereignty, remained remarkably humble about his historic role. In a rare interview granted to Abdo Zongo, he stated, "I only did what the situation demanded. Any African patriot would have acted the same. What matters is not what I did, but what we build collectively. A future where our nations determine their own destiny." In Washington, a leaked confidential National Security Council report admitted, "The era of discrete interventions in Africa is over. We must fundamentally rethink our approach to the continent or risk strategic marginalization in favor of our competitors." In African universities, new generations of students analyzed the Traoré moment as a watershed in the continent's international relations. Entire theses were dedicated to how a young leader from a small landlocked country managed to turn an attempted destabilization into a catalyst for a new diplomatic order. In Ouagadougou, life seemed to have resumed its normal course, but something intangible had changed in the atmosphere of the capital and the entire country. A new pride, a conviction that the future would no longer be written by others. In his office at the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré often contemplated the photo of Thomas Sankara, his political and moral inspiration. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, he felt as though the assassinated revolutionary smiled at him, as if approving the path taken by his country and an entire continent. The captain had achieved what many deemed impossible, turning the capture of 5 spies into a founding moment for a new conception of African international relations. The world watched with a mix of apprehension and admiration this Africa that now refused to be the passive stage of great powers. History may record that it was in Ouagadougou, in the hands of a young idealistic officer, that a significant page of global geopolitics began to turn, opening a chapter in which Africa would no longer be an object, but a subject of its own destiny.